Just once more, she said, and the moment those three words left her son's lips, directed at a total stranger, Claire Ashford felt the ground shift beneath her Louboutins. She had closed a nine-figure acquisition at 31. She had testified before the Senate Banking Committee without a tremor in her voice. She had buried her mother, signed the divorce papers, and walked back into the office the next morning in the same suit she'd worn to the courthouse. Claire Ashford did not shake. That was the thing people said about her, in boardrooms, in profiles, in the quiet, envious whispers of people who wanted what she had built. But that was before Ben stopped talking. It had been 14 months since her son had last said a full sentence to her. 14 months since the accident on the I-94 overpass that had taken her mother and left Ben, 5 years old, strapped into his booster seat in the back, watching through the rear window as the other car spun. The doctors said his hearing was fine, his throat was fine, his brain scans were textbook. Selective mutism, they called it. A trauma response. His mind had decided that some things were too dangerous to put into words, so it had simply chosen silence. The Hargreave Capital Winter Symposium was not Claire's idea of a therapeutic environment. 3 days at the Drake Hotel in Chicago, 500 of the most competitive financial minds in the country, black tie dinners and breakout sessions about emerging markets and interest rate trajectories. She had considered leaving Ben with the nanny, the way she always did. Then Dr. Patel had looked her in the eye during their Thursday session and said, gently, but with the precision of someone who had spent 20 years saying difficult things to powerful people, "He needs to see you exist outside of crisis mode, Claire. He needs to see you be a person." So she had packed the rolling suitcase with the small dinosaur sticker on the handle that Ben had put there himself, one of his few non-verbal communications, a small declaration of ownership, and she had brought him to Chicago. The Drake was not built for 5-year-olds. That was obvious from the moment they walked through the revolving brass doors into the Gold Coast room lobby, with its vaulted ceiling and its marble floors that amplified every footstep into something that sounded vaguely like an announcement. Ben's hand tightened around her index finger. He did that sometimes. Not her whole hand, just the one finger, as though he was trying to hold on without committing to being held. "It's just a hotel," Claire said. She knew immediately it was the wrong thing to say. Ben knew what hotels were. What he didn't know was why any of this was necessary, why his mother kept bringing him to places that smelled like other people's perfume and hummed with the low-grade electricity of important adults doing important things. She had a 7 o'clock dinner with the Hargreave managing partners. She had 20 minutes to get Ben settled in the room with the babysitter the agency had sent. A college student named Kara, very cheerful, highly recommended, who Ben had assessed with a long, measuring look and then turned away from with the particular finality of a child who has made up his mind. The elevator was crowded. Ben pressed himself into Claire's side. Someone's phone rang with a loud, jarring ringtone, and she felt him flinch. By the time they reached the 14th floor, his breathing had taken on the shallow, controlled quality she had learned to watch for, the physical language he used when he was trying very hard not to be overwhelmed. "Okay," she said, crouching down in the hallway while Kara waited diplomatically a few feet away. "Here's the deal. You stay with Kara, you watch whatever you want, you order room service. I'll leave a note about what you can get." She paused. Ben was looking at the pattern in the hallway carpet, an intricate geometric design, repeating diamonds in burgundy and gold. "Ben," he looked up. His eyes were dark brown, the same as her own, and sometimes when he looked at her she felt with a kind of breathless vertigo how much of her was already in him. The watchfulness, the stillness, the way he processed everything before reacting to anything. 2 hours. "I'll be back by 9. He didn't nod, but he didn't look away either, which she had learned to read as acceptance. Dinner was long. It always was with the Hargreave partners. Lawrence, who asked precise questions in the tone of a man who already knew the answers, and Cornelia, who had the social intelligence of someone who had spent 4 decades in rooms where the wrong word could redirect $1 billion. Claire ordered the salmon and talked about the interest rate environment and her projections for the regional banking sector, and felt, For the 2 hours she was at that table, like herself again, in the way that was both a relief and a reproach. This was the version of her that functioned. The one who knew the words. She was back in the room by 8:47. Ben was asleep, curled on the far edge of the king bed in his pajamas, truck pattern, one hand tucked under his cheek. Kara reported that he'd eaten half a grilled cheese and watched 2 episodes of a nature documentary about ocean animals, and had at one point pointed at a manta ray on screen with what she described as a lot of enthusiasm. Claire sat on the edge of the bed after Kara left and watched him breathe for a while. This was something she did now. Something she hadn't done before the accident, or not with this particular quality of attention. She had always loved him, but she hadn't always been paying attention to the specific weight of him in a room, the small sounds he made, the way his presence changed the air around her. She thought about Dr. Patel's words. He needs to see you be a person. The next morning, the hotel symposium officially opened with a breakfast session on alternative investments that Claire had been looking forward to for weeks. She had arranged for Kara to arrive at 8 so she could be downstairs by 8:30. At 8:15, Kara texted, "Hi, Ms. Ashford. I'm so sorry, I have a family emergency. I can't come in today. I've called the agency. The agency could not send anyone until 11. Claire stood in the middle of the hotel room in her suit jacket and her silk blouse and looked at Ben, who was sitting at the small desk by the window eating cereal she'd ordered from room service, watching Chicago from 13 stories up. He was perfectly calm. He was always perfectly calm. That was one of the things that frightened her most. She'd missed the breakfast session. She sat at the desk beside him and answered emails on her phone while he looked out the window. Once, he pointed at something, a large delivery truck maneuvering through the street below, and she looked up and they watched it together for a moment, this enormous vehicle navigating a space that seemed too small for it, inching forward with improbable patience. "Nice driving," she said. Ben glanced at her sideways. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. By 10, the agency had confirmed a replacement sitter would arrive at 11:15. Claire had a panel discussion at 11 that she could not miss. She was one of the 3 speakers. She looked at Ben. "I need to bring you downstairs with me," she said, "just for a little while, until the sitter gets here." The conference area of the Drake was a different world from the lobby. Quieter, more purposeful, corridors lined with meeting rooms whose doors bore small printed signs. Ben stayed close to her, his hand around her finger again, as she navigated toward the pre-panel green room. The hallways were thickening with attendees moving between sessions, the low collective sound of several hundred people talking finance. She was reading a text from Cornelia about seating arrangements when she heard the door of the service stairwell open behind her. The man who came through it was not dressed for a financial symposium. He was wearing work pants with a canvas apron over them, the kind with multiple pockets, and he was carrying what appeared to be a commercial-grade power drill in one hand and a toolbox in the other. Dark hair, a few days of stubble, and a quality of unhurriedness that was conspicuous in a corridor full of people who were all somewhere between 3 and 7 minutes late. He nearly walked into Claire. He stepped back immediately. "Sorry about that." His voice was low, a little rough at the edges. "Didn't see you." Claire opened her mouth to say something dismissive. The corridor was crowded and she had approximately 9 minutes when she noticed that the man had stopped. Not because of her. He was looking at Ben. Ben was looking back at him. This was not unusual. Ben looked at people. It was one of the things he still did freely. Examined strangers with the unguarded interest of a child who had decided that watching was safer than speaking. Most adults responded to this by smiling automatically and then looking away, unsettled by the quality of his attention. This man didn't look away. He set the toolbox down on the floor beside him with a quiet clink and then, without any preamble or performance, crouched down to Ben's level. Not all the way. Not the exaggerated, theatrical squat that adults sometimes deployed with children to signal friendliness. Just enough that they were closer to eye level. "Hey," the man said. Ben didn't respond. He never responded to hey. But he also didn't look away. The man reached into one of the apron pockets and produced a small brass fitting, the kind used in plumbing or cabinetry, a hexagonal nut the size of a quarter. He held it up between his thumb and forefinger, turning it in the light. "You know what this is?" Ben looked at the fitting, then at the man, then at the fitting again. "It's a hex nut," the man said, conversationally, as though they were two people who had been talking for some time and had simply arrived at this topic. "Goes inside a cabinet hinge. Keeps the whole thing from falling apart." He paused. "You'd be surprised how many things are held together by something this small." He turned the nut between his fingers. Ben watched it like it was the most important thing in the room. "You want to hold it?" It was such a simple question. No exclamation point, no coaxing, no performance of trying. He just asked, the way you'd ask another adult if they wanted to look at something you'd found interesting. Ben reached out, slowly, and took the nut from the man's hand. Claire had stopped breathing sometime in the last minute. She became aware of this because she had to consciously remind herself to start again. Ben turned the brass fitting over in his small fingers. He ran his thumbnail along one of the hexagonal edges. The man watched him do it with an expression that Claire could only describe, privately, as professional respect. The look of someone who understood what it meant to examine a thing carefully before committing to an opinion about it. "Do you fix things here?" Ben said. The words were quiet, a little hoarse from disuse. But they were unmistakable. They were distinct. They were a real sentence aimed at another living person, and Claire felt them land in the center of her chest like something falling from a very great height. The man glanced up at her for just a fraction of a second. She saw the surprise in his eyes, something recalibrating, and then looked back at Ben without making anything of it, without treating it as a moment that needed to be celebrated or even acknowledged as unusual. "Yeah," he said. "Old hotel like this, some things always needs fixing. Good work if you like puzzles." Ben thought about this. "I like puzzles," he said. Claire's hand went to her mouth. She didn't know when that happened. "What kind?" the man asked. "The ones with pieces," Ben said. And then, after a pause, "What's your name?" "Cade," the man said. "What's yours?" "Ben. Ben." He said it the way someone says a name when they're filing it away. "You good with that? I need it back eventually. It's the only one I've got." Ben looked at the hex nut in his hand. He looked at Cade. He placed the fitting carefully back into the man's outstretched palm with the gravity of someone returning something valuable. "Okay," Ben said. Cade stood. He picked up the toolbox. He looked at Claire for the first time in several minutes, and there was something in his expression now, something more complex than the easy calm he'd projected at Ben. Not pity. Not the soft, deferential awkwardness people used around her when they sensed something difficult in a situation they didn't fully understand. Just a kind of clear-eyed recognition, one adult to another. "He's good," Cade said quietly. "Not a question." Claire realized her throat was very tight. "Yes," she managed. "He is." He nodded once, picked up the drill, and continued down the corridor in the direction he'd been heading. She stood there for a long moment. Ben was looking up at her. "He fixes things," Ben said. "He does," Claire said. "With small pieces, with small pieces." Ben looked in the direction Cade had gone, though he'd already turned the corner. "I like him," Ben said. And then Kara's replacement sitter arrived, and Claire went to her panel discussion, and she delivered her remarks on the regional banking outlook with the same precision and controlled authority she was known for. And no one in that room could have possibly known that she had spent the previous 3 minutes in a hotel corridor silently crying into her own sleeve. The panel ended at 12:40. She found the maintenance office on the lower level of the hotel by asking the front desk, who referred her to the event operations coordinator, who referred her to a woman named Jan, who managed the in-house facilities team, and looked mildly surprised to be sought out by a symposium attendee in a Chanel jacket. "I'm looking for someone on your team," Claire said. "Cade, I don't know his last name. Dark hair. He was working on the second corridor of the conference level this morning." Jan checked a clipboard. "Cade Mercer. He's contracted. Not in-house. He does specialty restoration work for us. Plasterwork, custom cabinetry. Old buildings like this need people who know what they're doing." She paused. "Is there a complaint?" No, Claire said. Not a complaint. She found him in a small room off the main corridor. What had once been, according to the brass plate on the door, a coat check, with the walls partially stripped and the original millwork exposed. He was working on a length of cornice that had separated from the wall, applying what looked like hide glue with a small brush, the kind of painstaking work that required patience and a genuine understanding of how old things were made. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. Miss Erbs. Ashford, he said, which meant he'd learned her name somewhere between this morning and now, which meant he'd been curious enough to find out. Claire, she said, can I have a few minutes? He set the brush down on a piece of cloth and turned to face her, leaning against the work table with his arms loose at his sides. He had the relaxed posture of someone who was comfortable in small rooms, in long silences, in situations that hadn't been planned. She had prepared something to say. Standing here in this half-restored coat-check room with the smell of old wood and adhesive, and 100 years of accumulated effort in the walls, what she had prepared seemed inadequate. My son hasn't spoken a full sentence to anyone in 14 months, she said. Since an accident. He talks to me sometimes a little, but not like that. Not just asking questions. Not like he was talking to someone he'd just met. Cade was quiet. She had the sense that he was the kind of person who waited until he was sure he had something worth saying. How old? He said. 5. He absorbed this. My daughter went through something similar, he said, after her mother and I separated. Not the same, nothing happened. She just went quiet for about 8 months. Wouldn't talk at school, wouldn't talk to most family. Talked to me. He paused. And to the guy who delivered our mail for some reason. Completely unpredictable who they decide is safe. What changed? She figured out the world wasn't going to end, he said, and I stopped trying to make her talk and just let her be around things, around work. I do a lot of jobs where I take her with me. She'd sit in the corner and watch, and one day she just started running commentary. Something moved across his face that was unmistakably fond. Hasn't stopped since? How old is she now? 7. She's here, actually, with my neighbor in the hotel. She had a dentist appointment yesterday in the city, so we made a trip of it. He paused. I don't usually bring her to jobs, but she wanted to come to Chicago, so. The information rearranged something in Claire's mental image of the morning. A man who brought his daughter to jobs. A man who had sat with a silent child long enough for the silence to mean something different. I want to ask you something, Claire said, and I want you to tell me if it's inappropriate. Okay. Ben responded to you in a way he doesn't respond to most people. I don't know what that means, exactly. But I know that his therapist has been trying for 14 months to get him to do what he did in that hallway in 30 seconds. She paused. I'm in Chicago through Sunday. Ben doesn't have the symposium itinerary. He has a hotel room and a replacement babysitter and a view of Lakeshore Drive. She looked at him directly. I would like to propose that you and your daughter have dinner with us tonight. In the hotel restaurant or elsewhere, whichever you prefer. No agenda, no therapy, just dinner. She paused again. And I would like to pay for the meal, which I recognize is a strange thing to say, but I find that being direct about money prevents confusion. There was a silence. My daughter's name is June, Cade said. She's allergic to shellfish. I'll make sure to note that, and I don't need you to pay for dinner. I assumed you'd say that. But I'll let you choose the restaurant, he said, because you probably know this city better than I do. His expression, at the edges, had something in it that was not quite a smile, or rather it was a smile that was being held in reserve, for use at a later time. She chose a restaurant 3 blocks north, a place with good pasta and booths with high backs that made the noise level manageable, and they met in the hotel lobby at 6:30. June Mercer was small for 7. With her father's dark hair and a pair of glasses with red frames that she wore with the earnestness of someone who had chosen them very carefully. She assessed Ben with the frank curiosity of a child who has learned to be interested in things rather than afraid of them. Ben assessed her back. Then June said, Do you know what the fastest land animal is? Ben considered. He held up one finger. June's eyes widened. A cheetah. Yes. Do you know how fast? Ben shook his head. 75 miles per hour, June said. My dad looked it up because I asked, and he always looks things up. Ben turned and looked at Cade with an expression that suggested this was relevant information about character. They walked to the restaurant like that. June talking about cheetahs, and then pivoting to the deep ocean, and then to something she'd seen on a science program about soil composition, and Ben listening with total attention, and Cade and Claire walking slightly behind them in the late October cold off the lake, their breath visible, neither of them speaking for half a block. She always like this? Claire said. Since she started talking again, he said. She's catching up. Dinner lasted 2.5 hours. June ordered pasta and explained the taxonomy of insects to Ben with the aid of a paper napkin she'd drawn on with a borrowed pen, and Ben, once, twice, then with increasing frequency, said things back to her. Not much. Short answers, clarifying questions, the occasional correction when June's taxonomy was imprecise. But words, sentences, the real thing. Claire watched this from across the booth and ate her rigatoni and occasionally answered Cade's questions about the symposium and Chicago, and eventually about Hargreave Capital, which he'd clearly looked up because he asked specific questions that suggested he'd read more than the homepage. He asked them without the stiffness of someone trying to impress her, but with the natural curiosity of someone who was interested in how things worked. She asked about the restoration work. He explained, in the same unadorned way he'd explained the hex nut to Ben, how old buildings held their histories in their materials, in the species of wood, in the composition of the plaster, in the joinery techniques that dated a piece as surely as a signature. He'd learned it from his grandfather, who'd learned it from his. He had a workshop outside Columbus. He traveled for the work when the work was worth traveling for, which was not always, but the Drake job was. What determines whether it's worth it, she said. He thought about this. Whether the building has earned it, he said, whether someone cared enough to save it. At 9 o'clock, both children were visibly fading. Ben had his chin propped on one hand and his eyes at half-mast, still listening to June, who was describing what she would do if she found a time machine with the seriousness of someone presenting a business plan. Cade settled the check before Claire could reach for her card. She gave him a look. You chose the restaurant, he said. I covered it. Even. That's not how math works. Sure it is, he said, and left enough on the table to cover twice the bill. They walked back to the hotel. Both children were quiet now. June had talked herself to a standstill, and Ben walked beside her with the comfortable silence of someone who has found a person whose company requires nothing from him. At the elevator, June looked up at Ben and said, Tomorrow my dad is going to show me the room he's fixing. You could come. Ben looked at Katie. Katie looked at Claire. Claire looked at her son's face. The careful, measuring look that preceded every decision he made, the exact expression she saw in the mirror each morning, distilled into something younger and more legible. Is that okay? Ben asked her. He had not asked her that in 14 months either. He had not asked her things. He had waited and watched, and sometimes accepted and sometimes refused, but asking, framing a question and directing it at her with the expectation of an answer, that had been one of the things that went away. Her throat did the thing it had been doing all day. She managed to keep her face level. Yes, she said. That's okay. The next morning, Ben stood in the half-finished coat check room and watched K-Day work with the focused, proprietary attention of someone who has been given access to something important. Katie explained what he was doing, not performing explanation, not teaching, just narrating his own actions in the offhand way someone might talk to themselves, and Ben tracked every movement. June sat in the corner on an overturned supply crate with a book, periodically looking up to add information or ask her father questions that were usually more complicated than the work itself. Claire sat in the doorway with her laptop and worked, or tried to work, and found herself instead watching her son exist in a small room full of old wood and careful attention and the smell of something being restored. At one point, Cade handed Ben a small brush and gestured at a section of cleaned cornice and said, Here, just along that seam. Light pressure. And Ben took the brush and applied it with extraordinary seriousness, and Cade said, Good, in the same tone he'd use with anyone, And Ben looked at the work he'd done and did not smile. Smiling was still something he was working back toward, but something in his face opened, like a window. On Sunday morning, the last day of the symposium, Claire had a closing session at 10 and a car to O'Hare at 2. She was packing Ben's small suitcase when there was a knock at the door. Cade was in the hallway with June. He had an envelope in his hand. "The Drake job wraps up end of December," he said. "After that, I'm back in Columbus." He held out the envelope. "My business card's in there. Also June's drawing of Ben, she made it last night, and my personal number, which is the same as the business number because there's only one of me." Claire took the envelope. "I'm in Columbus 3 or 4 times a year," she said. "Hargreave has a regional office there." "I know," he said. "I read about it." The smallest smile appeared on her face before she could stop it. "You research my company?" "I research everything," he said without apology. "It's how I know what I'm working with." She looked at him for a long moment, this man with plaster dust on his forearm and a 7-year-old who knew cheetah speeds and a way of being in the world that was the exact opposite of the way she moved through it, and which had somehow, in 3 days, made her son ask a question again. "Cade," she said. "Claire, thank you." He shook his head, the small, dismissive motion of someone who doesn't accept gratitude for things they'd have done anyway. "He did it himself," he said. "I just was in the hallway." She looked at Ben, who was standing beside her in the doorway now, looking up at June. "June," Ben said. June looked at him. "What would you do first?" he said, with the time machine. June's face broke into the most complete smile Claire had seen on a child in a very long time. "I thought you'd never ask," June said. Cade caught Claire's eye over both their heads, and in that moment, in a hotel hallway in Chicago, with 2 children negotiating the particulars of time travel, and the lake wind pressing against the windows at the end of the corridor, and her son's voice filling the air around her like something that had been missing, and was now returned. Claire Ashford felt something unlock in her chest that she hadn't even realized was still closed. Not fixed. She understood by now that some things don't get fixed so much as worked with, tended to, rebuilt from the inside, using whatever materials are still sound. Her mother had known that. Ben was learning it. She thought, beginning to understand it herself. She tucked the envelope into her jacket pocket, where she would keep it for the rest of the day, her hand returning to it periodically on the drive to O'Hare, in the boarding line, on the plane home, the way you hold onto a hex nut, small and solid, knowing what holds together when you can't see the seam.